Sport Business. Global Sports Intelligence.
Hello and welcome to the Sport Business Podcast, getting you up to speed with the stories powering the global sports industry. I'm Catherine Davies, your podcast host, and this week I've got Frank Dunn, our Sport Business Editor-at-Large, on the line to give us some key insights and bold predictions from his newly published roundup of English Premier League media rights, domestic and international, over the next cycle through to 2028. I'll also be welcoming Matthew Glendinning and Jonathan Rest, who will join me to talk about a landmark agreement reached by the stakeholders of the America's Cup sailing race that will shake up the commercial and competitive structure of all future events from 2027. And this week we'll also be dedicating a section of the podcast to the highly respected and well-loved industry executive Josh Burack, who very sadly passed away late last week. Martin Ross and Josh's business partner Nick Haigh will join me to pay tribute to Josh and to remember him as a charismatic, respectful and generous man who will be missed by so many. Please join us in paying our respects and in celebrating Josh's contribution to our industry. The sport business will be a poorer place without him. Let's take a short break now. We'll be right back with Frank Dunn's deep dive into the Premier League's media rights. Welcome back to the Sport Business Podcast. Now, Frank Dunn, Sport Business's editor-at-large, has just joined me from his home office in Bologna, Italy, where I understand it's a bit toasty. Frank, it's always good to have you on the pod. Thank you for joining us. How are you bearing up in this latest heat wave?
Relying heavily on air conditioning, which obviously isn't fantastic for the environment, but it's been about 35 every day for the last week. And will be for another week. So tough going. I don't like the heat.
That is tough for a good Mancunian like you, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Well, now, Frank, this week we've published your very comprehensive and data-driven insight on the Premier League's media rights in this next cycle, the 3 seasons from 2025 to 28. And you noted that the Premier League has posted healthy increases in media rights revenue over the last 2 cycles, despite the ongoing bear market, and it looks to have done the same in this upcoming one through to 2028. What can you tell us about the media rights increases?
Yeah, well, we did our research. I mean, most of the research that we do is on the international side. Obviously, the Premier League publishes usually the values of its domestic deals. But our team has spent the last couple of years tracking down every individual deal that the Premier League has done all around the world. So even though my byline is on the article, it's actually, full credit to the team. Really is a lot of hard work has gone into this. Basically, our takeaway numbers for the cycle as a whole, and all of these are in dollars, just for the sake of comparative numbers. We do everything in dollars. We get them coming out about $5.1 billion per season, which is an increase on the last cycle of around 22-23%. And that in turn was an increase on the previous cycle of about 11%. It's worth pointing out, though, I'd say as a caveat, that for the new cycle 25-28, we've taken a fairly arbitrary date for conversions. Now, the Premier League, as you know, does deals in pounds sterling domestically, and on the international market, it does deals in both euros and dollars. So the trick, one of the problems with these Premier League roundups is that there's always an issue around the conversion rate and when you take it and so forth. At the moment, we've taken for this cycle, August 25, we've taken the rate now, and the pound is much stronger now against the dollar than it was in both 22 and 2019. So that we have to allow for the fact that these numbers are slightly skewed by an exchange rate in the meantime.
Unlike most other major European leagues, and indeed unlike most major domestic sports properties anywhere in the world, the Premier League's international media rights revenues continue to outpace domestic ones. That wasn't always the case, I don't think. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, this is the second consecutive cycle that's been the case. There's not a massive difference between the two, but for the last 2 cycles, the international has been more valuable. And I think that basically the Premier League obviously has become, over time, probably along with the Champions League, it's become one of a small handful of properties which are actually fundamental to pay television broadcasters around the world. I think even in the teeth of a really difficult market, they went to market this time 25-28, they've done exceptionally well. I think that their performance is pretty amazing, really. And I think that domestically, obviously, it's a critical market, but you're dependent on a small number of factors. And if you have a limited competition domestically, that will have a huge impact on that half of the value portion.
Well, now, the Premier League is by far the most valuable football league in the world and the second most valuable property worldwide after the NFL, the National Football League in the US. And we've done a lot of research on that for our global media report. And some people would leap to the defense of the Indian Premier League of cricket, and certainly in a media rights revenue per match comparison, that's true. The IPL comes after the NFL and before the Premier League, but it only has 74 matches a year, whereas the Premier League has far more. Do you think the Premier League's position as the second most valuable league will continue? How far away is it from the NFL? What's your projections for that?
It's a long way away from the NFL. I think the real threat actually to the Premier League is not the IPL, but it's the NBA. I think there's a possibility that from next year, the NBA could take that number 2 spot. But I think for the moment, it's definitely solidly number 2 behind NFL. But I think the way Premier League clubs think, I don't think they lose any sleep about the daylight between themselves and the NFL. And I also don't think that the absolute value of a cycle is as important to them as their comparative value compared to La Liga, Bundesliga, Serie A, and Liga. And in that respect, in the last few years, their position comparatively vis-a-vis the others has actually got stronger. There's more daylight now between the Premier League and the other domestic leagues. And I think that is the most important thing to the clubs, that what they're looking at is, do we have the money to buy the best players and to pay the top wages? Who are we competing with? Are we competing with Barcelona? Are we competing with Bayern Munich? So the comparative position of the Premier League vis-a-vis the others is stronger now than it's ever been.
I think that will be much to the chagrin of Javier Tebas of La Liga, who I remember even 10, 12 years ago saying that their target was the Premier League and their goal was to catch up, if not surpass. It sounds like that's not likely to happen anytime soon. But let's look further down the road. The consensus among most expert commentators is that the Premier League, will struggle to maintain the value of its media rights in the next cycle, given the current market conditions. Do you share that view?
No, not at all. Everybody's wrong. And I'll explain why. There are several reasons why. First of all, I'm convinced that Ofcom, the UK regulator for the media and communications market, will take the shackles off the Premier League in 2 ways. I think that it will allow the Premier League to sell the rights without having a no single buyer rule, in the same way that regulators in Denmark, Germany, and Italy have considered. I think that's the direction of travel for national regulators. I think that will happen. I think that they will allow the Premier League to do an even longer deal. They've just done 4 years domestically. I think Ofcom will allow them to go to 5 or even 6 years. So 2 things to bear in mind. You have a premium for exclusivity. If one media company can buy the whole lot, there's a premium automatically for the exclusivity. There's a premium for longevity. I'm also convinced, and I think there are a lot of people out there who would agree with me, I'm convinced that from the next cycle, the Premier League, together with the Football Association, will withdraw from Article 48, the famous UEFA Article 48, the closed hours. So I believe that from the next cycle, the Premier League will make available to domestic broadcasters all 380 games for the first time ever. So you have a third type of premium related to volume. And I think if you add those 3 things together, I think the Premier League, this is pure guesswork, but I think the Premier League is set for an increase of 20-30% in its domestic rights next time round, after a couple of difficult cycles. Obviously, there was the rollover because of COVID, which kept things flat. A slight increase last time round because there hasn't been a huge amount of competition to Sky. But I think the moment you put those things in the market, obviously Sky is going to be interested, but I think it's going to face competition. Somebody will want to imagine being in the UK. Sky has been dominant in terms of, the Premier League since day one. But imagine being the only place where in the Premier League where you can see everything. That's a really powerful position, and people will compete for that, and Sky will pay a premium for that. Absolutely no question. So I think the pessimism about the domestic market is misplaced. The big question then becomes whether they can maintain or even increase the international value. And that's where I think it's much more difficult to predict, because there are so many different markets. And I think there are a handful of really critical deals. And I think this is the first market they will come to, is the US. That's by far the most important and the most valuable single deal outside the UK for them. And maintaining that value with NBC outside of the UK is their biggest single challenge. Are they set well to do that? I think there are two things here that are worth bearing in mind. First of all, I'm convinced, again, this is guesswork, and I may prove to be completely wrong, but I'm convinced that in the next cycle, there will be a Premier League regular season game hosted abroad, and I'm also convinced that it will be in the US. And I think that will provide the broadcaster, whether it's NBC or another player, with a real tentpole event experience, even if it's only one game in the season. It's not going to be transformational in terms of absolute value, but it'll be hugely important to whichever broadcaster gets that. I think that will happen. I think the other thing to bear in mind is that, okay, yes, globally it's a bear market generally. The United States, the streaming wars have died down. And so you could look at it and say, well, it's not a great time to come to market. But you have to bear in mind the Premier League will be coming to market in the immediate aftermath of the World Cup. And there is no single time in the history of broadcasting that is better to come to the United States to try and sell soccer rights. And they've got the best league in the world. They've got the best product in the world to do that. So I think there are reasons why you could look at the US and say it's going to be tricky, but I think they're in a strong position. Then I think there are other really critical markets. I think the Middle East and North Africa, where they've had this long-term relationship with beIN Media, that is really, really difficult to read. I think the big question that everyone's asking is whether or not the Saudis will really start to compete against beIN for premium rights. If that were to happen, then you could imagine the Premier League at least maintaining and maybe increasing value. There's some kind of, if the Saudis come in some kind of aggressive way into the next cycle, but impossible to read. Nobody knows. I think even in Riyadh, if you were to ask them right now, nobody knows what's going to happen for the Premier League. So that's a big question mark. Sub-Saharan Africa, one of their most valuable deals for a very long time. That's, again, tricky to read, but you have to bear in mind that we've had this merger of MultiChoice and Canal Plus, which is going to take a lot of the competitive pressure out of the market. There are players in there, like New TV and potential new players, but I find it difficult to imagine by the time they come back next time, Saharan Africa will be a really competitive market. That will be a challenge, maintaining. They've got a great relationship with SuperSport. They've always had a great relationship with Super. And the Premier League has been burned badly in the past on a couple of occasions by getting into bed with new players who hadn't really demonstrated their track record as broadcasters. And they've learned from that. They won't do that again. So if they can, they will renew again with SuperSport, but only if SuperSport is putting the right money on the table. And then there are a whole load of other markets you have to bear in mind. There's China, there's markets in Asia, there is Australia. There are lots of markets where, on the face of it, you would look at it and say, dynamic isn't great. But we're a few years away yet from them going to market. My gut instinct is that every time any major property goes to market globally, they will have some wins and some losers. And I think that basically my gut instinct is that the Premier League will be there or thereabouts. I mean, it may be a little bit above, it may be a little bit below. But I think if you add that together with the domestic, I think they're going to come out ahead. The really critical question, and forgive me for going on about this too long, if I am, I think over and above any individual market dynamics, I think a couple of really interesting questions that people are looking forward to next time. One of them is whether or not there will be an aggressive global bid by one of the big US companies, be it an Amazon, an Apple, a Google, or even DAZN, whether that will basically change the way in which the Premier League does its business outside of the UK. And my feeling is that we are maybe one cycle too soon for that kind of bid. Now, there's no question that those companies are looking at it. There's no question that there will be conversations have been taking place for years between the Premier League and all of these companies. And we're talking as though this is a kind of a new thing. But bear in mind that 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, Google ran the numbers on making a global bid for the Premier League highlights rights, not live rights, but highlights rights on a global basis. They decided not to. But that's Google. That's 20 years ago when YouTube was infancy. So there's no question to me that these companies are looking at the Premier League, running the numbers, asking whether it makes sense. I think the question is, and these talks will be taking place informally. So no question these talks are taking place. My feeling is that there is enough juice left in the market for at least one more cycle of market by market sales. And I think that the Premier League chairman and owners will feel that this has served them well in the past. They're a fairly conservative bunch. They don't want to have a leap in the dark. And for that same reason, I would exclude the idea of the league moving to its own OTT direct-to-customer service as a global platform. There's no question, again, that they could do technically if they wanted to. They could turn it on tomorrow if they wanted to. Commercially, I don't think we're there yet. So I think internationally, the next cycle will still be market by market for at least one more cycle. And I think overall, the Premier League will come out ahead when you put domestic and international together. So I realise that I'm probably in the minority in that view, but I'm quite convinced of those points about the domestic scenario.
Well, those are bold predictions indeed, and it will be good to see what actually happens. And just thinking of the US and the media groups spinning off their cable channels and all the cord-cutting drama and so forth. And you look at Netflix in the US and Canada acquiring the Women's World Cup rights. Now, of course, that's a quadrennial event. It's not a domestic league with matches for 10 months of the year. But that makes me wonder if they're laying the groundwork for a major bid. And if you look at the market cap of these companies, it's many times what NBC has or WBD. I mean, I agree. I think a lot of people are going to be saying, oh no, this next cycle, we're going to be seeing a big bid. The NBA is on Amazon Prime in a number of countries around the world. The groundwork is there, but you're convinced that it won't happen for another cycle at least, right?
I don't think it will happen globally. I think it could easily happen in the US, for example, that for the US, that an Apple or a Google or an Amazon buys the rights for the US for streaming exclusively. I don't think it will happen on a global basis. I don't think the numbers make sense yet for these companies outside of the US, but I would expect there to be competition between all of these players. Netflix too, I wouldn't exclude Netflix. And again, I mean, go back to the point about the regulators in the UK. I think that we started in this business around the same time. And it was in that period between 97 and 2003 when there was this big regulatory interest in premium media rights. And we saw all of those deals of national regulators, the Netherlands, Germany. We saw the European Commission investigating Formula One, investigating the Bundesliga, investigating the Champions League. And from that period, what emerged was this kind of template, which became the kind of standard practice for everybody of 3-year deals and more than one buyer. That was the rule for a long time. And one of the reasons regulators are accepting rights holders being able to move away from that is that global market that these people are operating in now is actually transformed from those days. Sky, I mean, national and European regulators were very concerned for a long time about the dominance that Sky had in the UK pay television market. There were numerous investigations. And in those years, the early 2000s, if you look across Europe, a lot of the markets were kind of quite similar. You had 1 or 2 or 3 or sometimes more competitors fighting for that position in the national pay television market. If you look at the situation now, we've got Sky. Obviously, Sky is still very powerful in the UK pay television market. But what's changed is that any one of those companies that we mentioned before, Amazon, Google, Netflix, Apple, any one of those, if it chose to, within 5 years could wipe Sky off the map. If somebody at Amazon, if one of the top suits at Amazon said, it's critical for our business to become the #1 sports broadcaster in the UK, within 5 years, Sky will be history. And regulators have to understand that that is a totally different landscape. And I think they have to cut some slack to the Premier League in recognising that this is how the market's changed. The market is not as it was in 2003 when the Commission ruled on the Champions League. It's totally different and it's very difficult to read. And I think companies like Sky, which are essentially, Sky in the UK is a national pay television broadcaster, are now part of a competition with these global monsters who financially are on a completely different level. So I think, these factors, you take them all together, I think it's going to make the next cycle of the Premier League. It's going to be, I think, the outcome which will prove one of two theories correct in terms of the market generally. There are two kind of prevailing views. One is that the market as a whole has peaked, that the bubble has burst, that we're in a downward spiral, and that everybody, whoever they are, the next time they come to market, they're going to struggle to hold on to value and they're probably going to go backwards. The other view is that we're experiencing a period of polarization. And what's happening is that media companies are spending a greater proportion of their budget on a smaller number of properties. And there is no question that in that smaller number of properties, the Premier League is one of the 2 or 3 really super premium properties that people will fight for. I personally, I'm of the latter view. I don't believe in the idea of the bubble bursting. I think there's been a maturation of the market. There is a much more rational approach in many markets, but I think that there has been a polarization. Some rights holders will benefit from that, and the Premier League will definitely be one of them.
I wonder if the regulators, you say you might think that they would be looking to perhaps protect the skies of the world against the global monsters. Well, what about the consumers, though? Because I know here in Canada, if you subscribe to the pay TV broadcasters that show all the major rights here, the major properties, you're paying over $100 a month for your cable channel. Whereas if I subscribe to Netflix, the price has gone up, but it's gone up to $25. So the consumer is going to be the focal point as well. And people just don't want to pay for this. And they pirate it, or they just watch movies on Netflix. And I think there's a trend that way too, don't you?
The consumer is always and always has been the focal point of what regulators, why they get involved, to protect consumer. And I think the old logic was that if you had a super powerful Sky and Sky knocked NTL out of the market, then next time around, Sky would be a monopoly player. And this is the competition law theory. And I think I kind of have a slightly jaundiced view of regulators. I think that they're always 3 or 5 years behind where the market is. But I think there were many national regulators, I'm going back 20 years now, many national regulators that were stuffed with people who knew competition law theory inside out, but didn't really understand how markets worked. And I think that was one of the problems. Let me just give you an example. This is a complete rabbit hole. But just to give you an example of the difference between competition law theory and the reality of the market. In the early 2000s, a lawyer from the European Commission told Formula One that they had to make available their media rights for mobile phones. This was at the time when a mobile phone had a jerky 2-centimeter image, and that was all you could get. And Bernie Ecclestone said, I'm not going to put my content on a 2-centimeter image on a mobile phone until the technology can deal with that. Now, the regulators accused him of artificially reducing output and slowing down the development of new technologies, etc. All fantastic competition law theory. But he was right. And time has proved him right that, when the technology was available, when broadband came online and when, you could have smartphones. Now, of course, you can do a lot on a mobile phone. So I think there's always been this disconnect between competition law theory that regulators come with and the reality of the market. And yes, ultimately, it's all about protecting the consumer. And they will do that. But I think, ask yourself this question. If there was a head-to-head for the Premier League rights next time round, domestic, and there was a head-to-head between Sky and Amazon lost, would that put Amazon out of business? Would they not be there in 5 years' time to bid for the rights again? Of course they would. I think the market has changed. But I think you mentioned a key word there that we haven't touched upon at all. And this is going to be really critical, not just to the Premier League, but to everybody going forward. And that's piracy. And my view is that nobody has found a way to deal with piracy out there. Everybody has tried legal remedies. They've tried regulatory remedies. They've tried technological remedies. Nobody has cracked it. And that will be unquestionably a break on growth for the Premier League and for everybody else. But one small point, if they do make 380 games available in the UK, that will reduce piracy in the UK on those 3:00 Saturday games.
I wonder what impact will that have on the Premier League in the UK, making all the games available, on attendances and everything else that they were concerned about protecting?
Well, that's the official line of the Premier League, going back. Obviously, Richard Scudamore said this many, many, many times. The official line of the Premier League was that they were committed to Article 48 to protect the wider interests of the game. Now, you have to believe, if you believe that that was the reason, you have to believe that the average Premier League owner is really concerned about attendances at Deepdale on a Saturday afternoon, or how many people are playing football in Hackney Marshes. I never bought that was really the reason. I always thought it was much more to do with controlling the output to keep the price high. Now, they would deny that. Of course they would, because it gets into some pretty dodgy area in terms of competition law and behavior of a dominant supplier. But it always struck me that was a much more logical reason. I mean, I'm just thinking, coming at it from the perspective of an owner of a Premier League club. If you are the owner of a Premier League club, what are you more concerned with? Your revenues or the attendances at Preston North End? or the number of people playing football in Hackney Marshes. Realistically, come on.
I think that's pretty clear. Frank, I love your bold predictions going against the tide because, as you said, most people do predict a downturn in the next cycle. Love to hear what you've come up with, and I'm sure our listeners will as well. Thank you very much for taking the time, and we will see you again soon.
For a weekly roundup of the biggest stories shaping global sport, sign up to the Weekly Digest, our free newsletter packed with essential insights. Subscribe at sportbusiness.com.
Welcome back to the Sport Business Podcast. I'm here now with Martin Ross, our global news editor, and with Nick Haigh, CEO of Zeus Sports Marketing Group. Welcome to you both.
Hi, Catherine.
Thank you, Catherine.
I wish we were here in happier circumstances, but Martin and Nick are here with me today to pay tribute to Josh Burack, a highly respected industry stalwart who sadly passed away last week, aged just 54, after a brave battle with pancreatic cancer. Martin, you acknowledged Josh in a post and a Sport Business article this week, commenting on how you found him to be charismatic, respectful, generous, and always happy to help out a journalist. You said there was never any game playing. He was just a genuine guy without an agenda. Tell us more about your relationship with Josh over the years.
Thanks, Catherine. This was a tough one to report on. I was close to Josh, not as close as Nick in terms of having worked alongside him for a long time, but we were exchanging messages even up until a month ago. And the way in which he was handling everything he's going through was simply stunning, actually, I must say. I was always impressed with his selflessness, his professionalism, his real interest in how you were getting on. He was always would take time to meet us and, with a notepad or a golf marker. But over and above all, coming at it from as a journalist, he was just a very straight shooter. And in order to do his memory justice, I wanted to invite Nick onto the podcast to offer some sort of real insight into Josh as a person, as a close friend, as a negotiator. But before I turn it over to Nick, and I'm aware lots of our listeners will know exactly who Josh was, but I just wanted to offer up a sort of top line bio and maybe encourage anyone else who's maybe less aware that to have a look at the tribute piece that we did. So Josh's career started out in production. He did about a decade of production, documentary making for US networks, for World Sport Group, and then also producing World Feed for US ATP, WTA events. Then moved on to IC, where he worked alongside Nick. He was director of APAC, continued to travel hugely across the region, live in multiple different countries, and there he started to sell rights and secure event contracts across different sports. And then after the sale, or 4.5 years actually after the sale to Lagardère, he took a sabbatical, did a master's at the National University of Singapore, returned to the industry to begin work at Dentsu, which was a multifaceted role, but maybe most prominently negotiating Olympics media rights in large parts of APAC. Then had 2 years CEO of the Asian Tour. Keen golfer. Whether he's a talented golfer, maybe I'll let Nick tell us. And then he joined Nick at ZSM to steer the business while also retaining his Dentsu media rights work through their consultancy arm. So, Nick, thank you for joining us during which is a tremendously difficult time for everyone close to Josh. And I know that you're keen to share your memories. I mean, how will you remember Josh?
Well, first of all, thank you all, and thank you to everyone who is listening to this. For me, Josh will be most remembered for being a wonderful person deep down and at the core. His values knew no bounds. So wonderful person, an amazing best friend who would, Martin, you alluded to it earlier, he would selflessly be there, grant the time, but to me he was an amazing best friend. I remember him most fondly as being an amazing, tremendous, just a great business partner and colleague at various times throughout this journey. So words can't really put into perspective quite how unbelievable someone like Josh was, but I'll remember him most fondly for all of those character traits and more. And quite frankly, a short podcast doesn't really do justice to all the memories I've really got of Josh as a person. We could literally have this as being a 5-hour-long podcast in which there are all sorts of anecdotes which I'm happy to tell. So that would be how I would summarize things as succinctly as time allows.
Yeah, we could be here all day and all night, and already have had a few chats about it on the phone. Take me back to the IEC days. We're getting to know him. How early on did you and Jonas realise that you had somebody whose ability, as a multifaceted ability? He'd come from production, but then he was starting to work in rights sales and sponsorship. Obviously, his role then changed, went on to lots of different positions, as we mentioned. But was it clear pretty early on, the sort of talent set you had in Josh?
Yeah, I think it became rapidly early on. I remember the first time I met Josh, he was holding a tennis racket and we were in a hotel room in Miami in March of 2000, just ahead of SportL. That was the first time I met him. We developed a bond very quickly. That bond developed. He clearly had a very good understanding of the production values, which he was then able uniquely, because a lot of people just kind of find their niche and then leave it there. What Josh was able to do was take certain niches that he had and combine them to roll them into one very eclectic commercial person in the sports media business. And his tenacity in that regard and his hunger to do business and to develop IEC from a fledgling agency back when he and I both joined I think we joined within 6 weeks of each other, knew no bounds. So that was something that I was highly impressed by. So he and I hit it off because we joined at the same time. We had a lot of the same values. We had a lot of the same sense of humor, and we helped develop the business, as Jonas attested to in his very kind tribute.
Yeah, I mean, an exciting time for IEC. It was those kind of early years of where it was moving. You mentioned the sense of humour. Not averse to a wind-up, and this is something I appreciate greatly as a kind of Scotsman, having grown up in England. But I believe on trips to Stockholm, he wouldn't mind putting it to the Swedes a little bit.
Yes, he did. He did tend to wind the Swedes up. He loved to bet against the Swedes, and he loved to bet against me as an Englishman. And it didn't matter who we were playing, what the sport was, he always wanted to have the upper hand in that regard. And that just showed his competitive spirit and nature. I remember it was SportL maybe, it must have been either 2003 for qualification for 2004 Euros or 2005 for qualification for 2006 World Cup. And we were at a table and we were 18 people. And there were 15 Swedes, myself, Josh, and another, I believe it might have been a Scotsman, actually, Martin, ironically. And he took great pleasure in betting against every single Swede in the room against when Sweden were playing, I think it was Denmark. And Denmark scored. And he ran around the room like a maniac, celebrating the goal. And I remember the glum faces and the disdain that came from the Swedes present in the room, that he took such pleasure in this. But it was just part of, the idiosyncrasies that epitomized Josh. And it was well intended. It was just his way. And he used to back lots of times against me when England were playing in the World Cup. I remember back at our house in Switzerland, it was England, USA in, I want to say, 2010 World Cup, and USA equalised and he ran around again like a maniac, which, anyway, I forgave him for that.
For all his, politeness and respectfulness and that kind of Japanese culture, maybe, I don't know, but he was a tenacious character. I mean, anybody who turns up at Paris 2024, 5 weeks after breaking an ankle in a moon boot with crutches to work is not to be messed with. I mean, could you maybe shine some light on him in negotiations, on your travels across Asia, across South America, what he was like as a deal maker? Yeah,
there's a couple of things that spring to mind, actually, Martin, in that regard. You mentioned Paris 2024 and deal making. I know how difficult and challenging the media rights industry, especially in Asia, is. It's less competitive than it was, it's less lucrative than it was, and he had a really difficult task. But one of Josh's unique skill sets was his ability to liaise with all rafts of people. He could talk just as well to a homeless person as he could to a president. Take the picture that you kindly showed in your piece of him with Barack Obama together with Michiko. So he could do that. And part of his success in the Olympic Games sales process for Dentsu was his ability to go above and beyond. So whilst talking to broadcasters, he'd also go and rub shoulders with governments And that was part of his tenacity. I'll never forget another story early in the IEC days where we had done a small deal with a boxing promoter in Thailand who sadly passed away. And Josh was so hungry to get things done that he showed up to the funeral to pay his respects. But he had flowers in the one hand for the widow and a contract in the other hand, which is kind of just epitomizes who Josh was. He was always ready and on the go and ready to do whatever was necessary to get business across the line.
Josh being Josh, he would be doing that as polite and respectfully as you can in that circumstance. Be doing it in a very polite but I'm sure insistent manner. I mean, you touch upon the Olympic rights sales, which I maybe wanted to share a story I had from, I think it was Rio 2016. Josh was out in Brazil. One of his territories had gone right down to the line. I mean, we won't go into the weeds of different territories he had where there was little competition between market players. There was government involvement. It was a hard contract in many ways to make a good margin on, but one of the territories had gone right up to the line and wasn't going to be broadcast. So on the day it was a big story. And he kindly phoned me, and he was on the phone for 25 minutes as I got ready to play football as a goalkeeper playing five-a-side. I was still on the phone to him walking out, still on the phone to him, standing on the goal line with a goalie glove on, holding the phone. And my teammates were shouting at me, saying, we need to kick off this game now. And I shouted back saying, that's a huge Olympic story. And somebody just said, I don't care if it's Thomas effing back on the phone, we're playing right now. The time he took for us will always be remembered and appreciated. But certainly, and it was Dentsu, it was Hiroshi Mochizuki who had actually made a comment to that effect as to the kind of difficulties of the Asian market that they had to battle against. And I think the loss of rights to Infront, I think, hurt Josh in a way because a number had been paid that just wasn't, I suppose, realistic against what these rights were worth. But he took that, I think, like all of his work, very close to heart. Nick, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your company, about Zeus Sports Marketing, in terms of what you and Josh have managed to achieve since. You've had a pretty grueling travel schedule, often across South America. Josh would travel back to the States, I remember, when his father wasn't well. But all these trips to secure betting rights contracts, sponsorship business. What has he helped achieve in, 7 years that he was with the company?
Well, I think it was a relationship, professionally speaking, of complete dovetailing, where we had different skill sets that also combined and overlapped, and hopefully it was a 1 + 1 = 3 scenario. So taking examples of Latin America, we divided and conquered. So Josh would take on, for example, some of the state championships federations, where I would take on relationships with some of the betting aggregators. And it would be, like I say, we would each contribute in different ways, but his utter tenacity and never say die attitude, sometimes we had to kick each other in different directions to say, no, we need to keep going on this, we can actually do something. And sometimes he'd kick me and I'd say, yes, you're right. And sometimes I'd kick him and sometimes he'd say, yes, you're right. And I just think it made for a tremendous partnership. That partnership now is left with a tremendous void. Just to say a word on Mochi-san from Dentsu. I was present with Josh back in early May when he was able to play a couple of rounds of golf with me together. Mochi-san actually took the trip, which was about an 18-hour day, all told, to come and be with Josh and to spend time with us, but it was mainly with Josh. And we played golf together. And it just goes to show that the seniority of Dentsu as a massive organization, just how much respect they had for Josh, that one of their most senior executives would get up at 5 a.m., travel into the Gujo Highlands in the middle of Japan, play golf, have a lunch, rent a car, come back, and effectively after an 18-hour day. And that was all in recognition of the relationship that Mochi-san and the executives at Dentsu had for Josh, which just, to me, stands out, more than anything.
Yeah, and I think in a second, Catherine's maybe going to touch upon some of the external tributes, some of which mention golf. So, finally, I wanted to ask you And I regret to this day not taking up his very kind offer to come and play golf with him in Singapore. But there's been a couple of the tributes which have referred to a lot of practice swings. And I think Josh was playing off about 20, was he? But a very good tennis player at university.
His actual handicap, I think, was 10.6 in May. Definitely a lot of practice swings, definitely methodical, but I think that methodical nature also translated to the golf course, where he would always be the first one in the pro shop. He would always be the one buying the ball markers, the pitchfork repairers, etc., etc. He would always be that person, and he wanted to keep memories of every single place he played. And I'm fortunate enough to say that we played a lot of golf together all around the world. Yeah, those will be fond memories for sure.
Yeah, it just shows you what, I think when he joined Asian Tour, I remember him telling me his handicap was 20, which just shows you what joining a professional golf tour can do for your handicap.
Sorry, I'll just interrupt you there, Martin, if I may, and just say Josh was the only non-Japanese member to join Shokawa Kogen in the middle of the Gujo Highlands in the middle of Japan. And so much so that he insisted on being a member. They refused to have foreign members. And so, together with his wife, Michiko, they went to the board, wrote a letter, explained the situation, and said, and he always said to me, I'm going to be a member here. And they were like, we don't have foreign members. There are no non-Japanese members here. And he said, well, I'm going to be the first one. And he wrote letter upon letter, and Michiko helped him write letter upon letter. And eventually he became the only non-Japanese member, the first one ever. And I had the pleasure of playing there twice with him in early May. And it's a beautiful golf course. And just in true Josh style, he did it his way. And if he wanted something, he got it.
Thank you, Nick. It's a fitting way to offer a tribute to Josh, and all our thoughts are echoed by everyone here at Sport Business and across the industry, I'm sure. I think Catherine, as testament to that, has maybe got a few examples from what people have been saying.
I do have a few tributes to read. I just want to say I didn't know Josh well. I met him at industry events over the years, and I think we coincided at TWI back in the early 90s. But some of the comments I was reading talk about him being a mentor, and people learned a lot from him. So I think that really suggests that he supported people coming up in the industry behind him, and is a testament to his, he's a wonderful human being. And to further that, I'm going to read a few of the testimonies that we received on our posts and the article. The first one is from Peter Hutton, well-known and travelled senior industry executive, who says, Josh was a great guy who did so much to encourage others. We both arrived in Hong Kong in the handover year after working at TWI in London, and he typically made my life much easier from the start. A real pleasure to keep meeting him smiling all over Asia and to hear of his pride in his family. Jochen Lusch, the CEO of JL Sports Investments and formerly at MP & Silva Traffic Sports and Sport 5, said, simply a wonderful guy, huge loss. Floris Weiss, managing partner of Irish Sports Media, has a lovely story. He said, Josh very kindly reached out to me upon my arrival in 2015 and invited me for a round of golf. During the first 9 holes, he called me Joris, convinced that I was the president of IMG Media. Afraid to embarrass him, I waited until hole 8 to let him know that he was actually playing with Floris, not the president, but one of the guys at IMG. He took it with grace, and a nice working friendship evolved. Thierry Pascal, the senior vice president of international media at the PGA Tour, said, such sad and shocking news. One of our industry greats and a total gentleman. It was a pleasure working with him at his time at the Asian Tour and beyond. Rest in peace, Josh. Chris Guinness, IMG's Executive Vice President of Commercial Worldwide, said, this may be a multi-billion-dollar industry, but it's small when it comes to people. So reputation and integrity are everything. Josh was one of the very best in this regard. It is heartbreaking when anyone is taken before their time. Our hearts go out to his wife, Michiko, his son, Zach, and his daughter, Mia. I think that Josh's grace, his generosity, and his courage over his last few months are a lesson for us all and a message to simply seize the day. Carpe diem and rest in peace, Josh. Thank you both for joining me today. Martin, you'll be back later in the podcast. Nick, all the best to you, and I'm sure we'll cross paths again soon. Thank you both again. Now, with Josh firmly in our minds and memories, we'll take a short break and we'll return in just a few seconds.
Enjoying the conversation? Follow the Sport Business Podcast and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And if you're finding it valuable, leave us a rating and a review to help others discover the show.
Welcome back to the Sport Business Podcast. Now, today I've got Matthew Glendinning, our European sponsorship editor, here with me now in the studio, alongside podcast regular Jonathan Rest, to shed light on the landmark agreement that is shaking up the America's Cup. First of all, welcome back to the pod, you two. Good to have you with me.
Nice to see you, Catherine.
Hi, Catherine.
Now, Matthew, you wrote a story this week about America's Cup modelling Formula One in a commercial shakeup. How big a change in commercial strategy is this for the 173-year-old Sailing Challenge event?
Wow, what a question, because it is 173 years of history that has led to this point. So people are saying it's seismic, though they couldn't say it's any bigger. I think to put it in perspective, you have to just go back to how the America's Cup has functioned. The trophy, that old trophy itself, has been handed to the winners, who are called defenders. And they not only get the trophy, they then get the rights to exploit the next match. So they are required to organise it, but also they organise the commercial exploitation. I don't think their response is probably 173 years ago. Since then, obviously, there's been quite a few changes, but that general principle, defender owns the rights and then has to form some kind of, it's called a protocol with the competing teams to thrash out each time, every 4 years, a new way of doing the deal, which allows for lots of innovation, but also makes forward planning incredibly difficult. And so what they've done is defending team and the challenger team, which is the British team, Team Athena. Sorry, the defender team, I should say, is the New Zealand team, of course, seem to win all the time. They've agreed to sort of have an equal share of responsibility for the commercial program. So they've invented this new independent central executive called the America's Cup Partnership, which has stakeholders from all the teams. They can then go out and sell the rights, and they can not just sell rights, they can choose the venues and they can make other important decisions that should allow sponsors in particular to plan ahead and maybe make deals that are not just for one cycle.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on that. The interesting thing that Matthew said there, that, you know, the teams are going to be involved collectively in where this is going. And that's always been the big issue. Ideally, you would have the defender would say, OK, we're going to host it in our country, although, as Matthew said, it would always be in New Zealand. But actually, Grant Dalton, who was kind of CEO of that, still is that Team New Zealand, the dominant force, just said that last year, they just couldn't afford to host it in New Zealand. It just was not commercially viable. The cost outlay and the return on investment just wasn't there. Hence why they had to, speak to different cities and ended up hosting it in Barcelona. So having collective push for where this could be, perhaps kind of like a traditional bidding process that you've seen in other sports, would really kind of bring this to life, because it is, as Matthew says, it's kind of like you win, but then all the pressure is on you then to make the next event work. There's always like no benefit to it. So this is certainly a step in the right direction.
They've kind of ceded control of something that they found very difficult to control in the first place, the New Zealanders. So the next event is going to be in 2027 in Naples. So that, again, they're not hosting it in their own country. So they've ceded control, but I think the general feeling is that they'll probably be getting a bit more revenue than the others, initially at least, to enable this to happen. They've been under a lot of pressure from the others, to be honest, as well. So it's pretty amazing that they've got this deal done.
Now, Matthew, you referred to Formula One, and they're modelling Formula One in the new commercial shake-up, and I've read lots of comparisons to Formula One. How do you compare the new structure to the Formula One motor racing series?
Well, I think apart from the fact, Liberty Media aren't involved and there's no overarching sort of commercial organisation involved, there are some comparisons to be made. I think if you think of the old system, it's rather like if McLaren won the Constructors' Championship, they would then get to set the commercial rules for the next season. Now it's a partnership. Now everyone can have their say. And I think one of the interesting things is that, as I said before, all the sponsorships tend to be cycle to cycle now, and they can potentially make a 10-year sponsorship deal. They can make a 10-year broadcast deal. In Formula One, it's not uncommon at all for a central sponsor to be on a 5-year term, and everyone can start planning. So I think the fact a big difference, of course, is there aren't that many teams yet in America's Cup, and there may never be as many teams as in Formula One. It's not really an event that kind of lends itself to, maybe 10 or 11 competitors. Certainly, there could well be an expansion in the number of teams. Just one other interesting thing that they carved out in this agreement, and it's a really unusual thing that some people have picked up on. They've, unlike Formula One, where you obviously can't have anyone in the car with the driver, they've decided that they're going to allow a sponsor or an influencer or some other high-profile person to be actually on the boat during the racing itself. So everyone will have the chance to put in, whoever they think would be most valuable into the boat. And I think one of the things about America's Cup is that while it's obviously thrilling to be involved in it, I can't imagine anything better. It's often less thrilling to watch it. And so maybe by having an influencer chucked in or, chucking their guts out perhaps while they're racing might be a good way of enhancing the coverage.
I'd love to know if they've spoken to any of the sailors about this. The idea of kind of, these kind of world-class sailors having to kick a YouTuber out the way as they're, losing a race. It's a good idea. You can see just from the headlines it's grabbed in the last 48 hours that, they've gone down this route clearly. Interestingly, there was a line, wasn't there, Matthew, that you could have sponsors could be on there. You're opening up a different opportunity there for sponsors to sell a spot, if you like, on a boat. But I can just imagine some of the kind of diehard sailors getting a bit annoyed by some Hollywood or Z-lister in the way.
Yeah. It's not quite the same as the sort of main sponsor of a Formula One car putting their son in the driver's seat, is it? It's like, who are you going to choose? Your marketing director and throw him in? I don't know. Could be very interesting.
You've made the comparisons with Formula One, but I think there's inevitable comparisons with Sail GP, which is, of course, the annual race that is a national team race. And it's also been called the Formula One on water. And I must say that sailing coverage, watching it now, is much more interesting and engaging than it was 10 years ago. And Sail GP has been a big part of that with all the on-screen graphics, and they have people on the boat. So I'm not sure if they're influencers, but are we talking about two different beasts here? Sail GP has used the celebrity influence. They've got Ryan Reynolds and Hugh Jackman, the Bond's Flying Ruse team. And is the America's Cup going down that route?
I don't think so. I think they're different. I think we're just kind of comparing them because they're both fast boats on water. I think, the America's Cup is still a showpiece, 130 odd years old every 4 years, potentially every 2 years. I think, Matthew, right? There's a potential plan to make this a bit more regular.
Yeah, they're looking to make it biennial, which would be amazing.
Yeah. And then you've got, Sail GP, which is maybe 12, 14 events a year as a league. So I don't think it's comparable, but I think kind of one can help the other, if you like. If Sail GP, as we did a pod a couple of weeks ago, didn't we, on the celebrity buy-in, if you like, and the work they've done. You mentioned, I don't think they've got influencers on board, but they certainly pioneered TikTok-style videos on board and trying to increase their media appeal. So I don't think one is threatening the other at all. And I think potentially, you might have brands that look to kind of cross both, as they would do if they're sponsoring a European Football League and a UEFA or a FIFA tournament. If you look at it, there might be a brand that wants to align to sponsorship. One thing I wanted to ask you, Matthew, just because you've covered this for years and the commercial market and model, do you think this change is going to attract a new wave of sponsors, or is that unfair? Have we already seen a new wave of sponsors? Just looking at this last year, we had obviously Louis Vuitton's the headline sponsor, and that's got sailing links. And then you've got big names, Coke, Capgemini, UniCredit, Emirates, big sailing brand. Are there going to be new sponsors appealing here?
I think it may be the same sponsors, and like with Sail GP rather. I think sailing is the luxury brand kind of area, and many of the airlines or luxury cars and so forth. But I think where it might make a big difference is that the same brands will be in for more money and for longer terms. So the way the protocol works is that if you think about the next America's Cup will be in 2027, well, now that's all sorted out, they can start selling. But these sponsors only have 2 years to sell into it, 2 years to buy into it, moreover, and plan and activate. If you've got a much more planned schedule, I think the same sponsors could be on sort of a 4-year cycle or something like that, where they're paying more, they activate more, there's a lot more going on and a lot more value. So I think it may well be the same brands, but just paying more and with longer deals.
John, I think you've done a bit about the media rights distribution of the America's Cup and bringing up Sail GP again. They are relying more on maximum exposure over exclusivity and hefty rights fees. And they have a reliance on YouTube coverage as well. What does the America's Cup media distribution look like? They have coverage in each of the competing countries, but beyond that, where they go?
Yeah, that's always kind of been their early target market, if you like, to get those deals done. It's like every sport, it's that balance between reach and revenue, right? They want the money, obviously, and that traditionally comes, as we know, from pay TV, but then there is a heavy free-to-air, certainly on the highlights and clips. I think that's been quite crucial to kind of grow the sport and, talking about sponsors giving them visibility as well. But an interesting point that Matthew made there about kind of having perhaps a longer term calendar in place. I mean, if you look at last year's tournament, which I think was, race, it was in October, I think it started. They only completed the broadcast picture in the major markets in late August, and that was a deal with Warner Brothers in the UK, and there was a UK boat. So it's not always the case that they can get, deals in the big markets done early. And I think having perhaps something set in stone a bit more, I don't think it's ever going to be driving, it's still a difficult thing to watch on television, right? Despite all the excellent graphics that have been brought in, it's still a niche fan base. So I don't think you're going to see public broadcasters putting down huge rights fees just because this is suddenly you've got Tom Cruise on a boat. I don't think that's showing my age there. That's the only celebrity I can think of. Jake Paul or something. I don't know any YouTubers. I don't know. I don't think that's going to move the needle. I think certainly there's going to be a lot of digital coverage. I think that's going to play a bigger part. Everything is in the media platform now. But yeah, traditionally it's been live on pay with highlights on free to air in major markets as and when there was a broad Warner Brothers Discovery last year as well in the UK. They had a kind of pan-European deal which offered good exposure, but it's a difficult sell probably outside of the competing markets. Say there's 6 boats, 6 different countries, you're going to struggle in other markets, but they had blanket coverage last year, but the rights fees is not probably driving the money. That's probably more Matthew's side with the sponsorship.
And the hospitality as well, because if you invited to the America's Cup, you're going to get almost unlike any other event, you're going to get the best of the best, that's for sure. It's a bit like going to the Masters or something. So I think there's that money that can increase as well. I mean, I just wonder, if you're a broadcaster and maybe the monopoly that New Zealand have had on the actual competition itself is sort of wrested away, then you start seeing a British boat actually winning or a US boat winning or a French or Italian. I mean, that moves the needle a bit in those markets. If it just becomes seen as more competitive and if new teams join, even if it's just 1 or 2, that can also perhaps move the needle a bit.
Yeah, what I think has been quite important with something like Warner Brothers Discovery, when you've got that kind of bigger, powerful media operation with kind of 24/7 sports channels, you can put a bit more into the educational side of programming as well. If you want to entice new fans into sailing, something like the BBC doesn't have lots of hours for you to kind of be putting programming on. Yeah, you've got, that's where the kind of multimedia side of it comes in. And Warner Brothers did do a good job around that kind of storytelling, explainers, that kind of thing, which I think is really important for a sport like sailing, which has a kind of more niche audience, if you like, and followers. Not everyone has been on. It's not, you can pick up a football and go for a run and pick up a bat and hit a ball, but not many people can get on a boat and ride the wave. So I think you need that storytelling, which a lot of these broadcasters do really well.
The sailors themselves are maybe not that relatable. I mean, you're kind of asking people to watch titled sports people of great prestige, but maybe not that relatable.
Well, I must say I watched the first time I'd ever watched America's Cup was the one in Auckland in 2021, and I found it absolutely fascinating. And I've watched the next edition, and I plan to watch the one in 2027. And I think that's largely because of what they do on screen with the graphics, and people are mic'd up, and the stories behind the scenes and stories on land. I thought it was brilliant. So we'll see how they go with the new commercial structure. I think that's a really good introduction to the new shake-up, as you say, the Formula One style shake-up of America's Cup. Thank you, Matthew, for coming on the podcast. Thank you, John. And I'm sure we'll see you both soon. And we're going to take a short break now before moving on to part 2.
Want to get the full story beyond the headlines? Subscribe to Sport Business for exclusive news, data, and expert analysis. Learn more at sportbusiness.com.
Welcome back to the Sport Business Podcast. We're moving into the final part of today's pod, and John and Martin, as usual, are here with me today to look ahead to what's coming up next week. What's on your radar, you two?
I was going to start with Champions League qualifiers, partly as I have a vested interest. My team's playing Club Brugge, or Club Brugge, as all the cool people seem to say on commentary. The reason I mention it is because of the centralised parts of the media rights deals come into effect now, so it will be on TNT Sports, all the last round, the playoff round, which will be a relief for me and other Rangers fans. The Rangers game on Tuesday against Victoria Pilsen was streamed by Solid Sport at the price of £12 pay-per-view, which kind of blew me away that could be a price. It took me back maybe 10 or 15 years. I had the laptop out. I was watching it on there. To be fair, the sign-up process was actually pretty easy. Solid Sport, a Swedish company, so they've done quite a few of these sort of Scottish qualifying rounds, not just Scottish clubs, lots of clubs who in the early qualifying rounds, they pick them up and they stream them pay-per-view. But it was like going back sort of, as I say, 10 or 15 years in terms of pausing, audio out of sync, jumping around 2 or 3 minutes. Rangers scored a goal and it was kind of like a kind of remix when he hit the shot, and it kind of juddered for 4 or 5 times. I didn't know if the ball had gone in. Then I saw them celebrating. This was the first time a Rangers game had been on Solid Sport. And to be fair, they actually took it very well. They refunded everybody their £12. They blamed it on the local Czech production company. It was also on Rangers TV in certain markets. It was also on Czech TV, obviously. Just looking at X and so on and reports, I don't think that the issues were quite as bad on these outlets. But anyway, it just took me back to the bad old days of people getting streaming wrong. If you're going to charge £12, you need to get it right. Let's see if they get another Rangers game. But interestingly, in their sort of social media apology, they said that they'd had a very bad first date with Rangers. So let's see if it was a one night stand or if they have another date.
Expensive first date more than anything, £12, blimey. Mine, there's a World Cup TV rights stalemate in Greece at the moment, which I think Martin's hoping I'll chase up while I'm on holiday next week, but unfortunately I'm not going to do that, Martin. So my look ahead is actually this weekend, the Super Cup, the kind of kickoff of the German league. Imran's actually going to be out there for Sport Business, but just took me back to last year. It's always been, isn't it, Martin, a kind of chance to show off the tech innovation of the German league. And last year when I was there, I ended up watching part of the game in the back of a BMW, and it looks like kind of in-car entertainment is the next big kind of rights thing after we've got in-flight and kind of on cruise ships. So there was that, and there was referees with cameras and virtual headsets and everything. So I'm looking forward to hearing what gimmicks they're going to throw at Imran and the rest of the guys that are out there this weekend.
Yeah, some of them seem to stick. I mean, rail cams almost, seems to have stuck. It works better for certain sports, maybe like swimming, for example. It works very well. I think they were maybe one of the early ones that had cameras on the players. They had one on the corner flag one year. I don't know if that's worked. But yeah, like anything, some of them actually work really well and some of them really don't. So I'll be watching that. It will be on Sky in the UK, a very late deal over the line there. So looking forward to that.
Great. Well, good insights there. Any other business from you two for the week?
I wanted to mention a very big names. We write about a lot of big name sponsorships in our work. This is a particularly big name. It's 58 letters according to the English alphabet. It is, we'll come around to mentioning it in a minute, but it's the Welsh town with the very long name that has a railway station with an extremely long name, which I believe the name was kind of designed in such a way to be so long to make it a kind of tourist attraction. It's a deal with MasterCard. It's a 3-year deal. It's a 4th tier, but I know that I'm kind of putting off the pronunciation here, but it's a 4th tier Welsh team. They've signed a 3-year deal. They've got a shirt which is part inspired by Barcelona, as well as the windows at Llanfar Full Railway Station. Maybe let's all have a go at it, but the name of the team, I believe, is Llanfar Pofgwyn Gef Gugeth Yobachlan Silio Gugugoch. It's the best I can do.
Gosh, I don't think I could do better than that. I thought I could, but you nailed that. Well done.
That was impressive. I've actually found a website where it kind of spells it out for you. And there's a little video, and the guy can do it in 4 seconds, which is absolutely incredible.
For the purposes of the audio, I'm going to put on my cheat notes here. I've kind of broken it all down.
There we are.
That's your cheat sheet. Yeah, that's how you did it. Good stuff.
John? Yeah,
I'm not going to embarrass myself with that, Martin. You nailed that perfectly. Another big name, but in football, Neymar. Interesting, when we kind of look at global markets and we're talking to people on kind of media rights and sponsorship, we always kind of wonder if signing a big name player moves the needle. Obviously, we've seen that with Saudi Pro League and the media rights deals they got off the back of Ronaldo going there. And I was just looking at came across some numbers on Santos, Brazilian team, since Neymar signed in February. So he's been there just over 6 months, their social media numbers, impressions and views have gone up from 184 million in 2024 to 1.17 billion this year already. So nearly 500% growth, largely driven by TikTok, where they've got 630 million views. Can't remember how many we have in Sport Business. Our TikTok views, I think, is 2. And in all of 2024, Santos only had 12 million TikTok views. Just absolutely incredible, the power of this. And when he signed, actually in February, we did a piece on the number of sponsors that have signed up off the back of him joining there, and it just makes me wonder if they regret slightly, Santos as a club, joining the international media rights pool, because Flamengo didn't do that. They're selling, or they're distributing their international rights themselves on their own YouTube channel. And I'm wondering if, in hindsight, Santos should have done that, because I reckon they'd be getting some big old numbers on their international media rights views because of Neymar, who's 33 now. So he's only scored 6 goals, but he has played 6 games in a row for the first time in 3 years. So he's not exactly kind of fit that much. But yeah, just an interesting kind of social numbers there.
Huge number. It reminds me of when Nicolas Pepe joined Arsenal, John.
No, that was huge numbers in the transfer fee, Martin.
Yes, sorry.
Well, on the subject of TikTok followers, I got a report through from WSC Sports about AI-powered sports video content, and they say that the vertical video output has risen nearly 90% year on year and now accounts for 63% of total content. And they're predicting the rapid collapse of TV's dominance. I'm not sure about that, but whether that's happening really anytime soon, but it is remarkable if that's true about how many more people are watching sports content on their mobile phones. What do you make of that?
Yeah, brings us nicely back to the Super Cup, actually. It was, I can't remember if it was the Super Cup itself or the Bundesliga, but it was one of the first matches to have a vertical production, I think, in German football. So, yeah, it is what all the cool kids do, I believe.
And that means you, right, Martin?
No, certainly not.
All right. Okay. Well, I think that's a good note to end this week's podcast on. As usual, a great session, informed insight from you both, and from Matthew, of course, on our America's Cup section, and as well as our very moving tribute with Nick Haigh to Josh Burack. Thank you all. We'll be back next week with more industry intelligence and insight. Have a good week in Greece, John, on your holidays, and we'll see you all next week.